Lexi and this is Hannah and we're Wild About Conservation.
This is the podcast where we explore the world of conservation through discussions with our very knowledgeable guests. And in this season, our focus is on all things open ocean.
In this episode, we chat with Jess. She's a friend of ours who works in Cambodia as a sustainability manager for Six Senses Resort. They're aiming to be plastic free within the next few years, so that's really exciting. But we talked to her about her work in Cambodia and the route she took to get there, from education to internships, and how she fell in love with the magic that is coral.
We did learn an awful lot chatting to Jess today about all things coral, including what they are, where they can be found, how babies come, and what you, our listeners, can do to have a positive impact on these awesome ocean ecosystem engineers. We hope you enjoy listening to this podcast. Please remember to leave a review, get in touch on Twitter, and if you would like to support us as creators, we do have a Patreon. Check out all of the links in the show notes and the description on our website. Enjoy! Hi, thank you for chatting to us today. So can you firstly introduce yourself to our listeners, who you are, what you do, your pronouns, and your key interest in conservation?
Hi, my name is Jess. My job is sustainability manager and marine biologist. I identify as she/her, and my key interests are coral ecology and zero waste living.
Oh, we're so excited to chat to you about all of that today. But before we take the dip into all things coral, we do have a short game that we like to play with our guests. So it's supposed to be really fun, and it's a quick fire round of a couple of questions to keep you on your toes. So we can get to know you a little better and it kind of warms you up. So, if you could be any animal, what would it be?
Oh, I can't do quick fire for this. A shark. I love sharks. Okay, I'll be a shark.
Would you rather be a dung beetle, a mayfly, or a cockroach?
Cockroach. Cockroaches are cool.
And what is something that you're grateful for today?
The ocean. Every day, of course.
Love it.
They were just the best answers, Jess, and just exactly what I would kind of expect you to say as well. I feel like for everyone listening, we should mention that Jess is such a good long-term friend of both Lexi and I. So this is also an amazing point for us to catch up with Jess too. But before we start going into everything, we ask everyone every episode how they get wild about conservation. So Jess, how do you get wild? What do you do? Or what do you like doing?
Oh, I love the marine environment. I'm always in the sea, always. So I guess that's how I get wild. But I do have the privilege of living in like a warm country. I'm not sure if I lived back in the UK, I could do the wild swimming. I'm like a fair weather swimmer.
Yes, I feel that so much because Hannah last year started wild swimming and I've been invited along a couple of times and just can't convince myself to do it because I love snorkeling and swimming in the warmer climates, but Scotland doesn't do it for me.
It's so pretty though. Someone asked me yesterday, they were like, but if I learn to dive here, what will I see? And I was like, how dare you say that? There is so much to see. But yes, it is much colder. I do look forward to going somewhere tropical though and being able to swim without a wetsuit on or dive without a wetsuit on would be nice. I'm just going to go see Jess.
Yeah, the Farne Islands. Have you been there? We know where they have the seals. I want to do the seals. Oh, they look so great.
I've yet to dive with a seal, which would be great. Or I would like to go, I'm going to try and go basking sharks this summer, which will be super
yes,
cool.
Or the blue sharks.
Yeah, I didn't kind of realise all of the blue sharks down south, but there are, Cornwall and Wales, I want to say.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think actually Scotland has some pretty good diving. Like, if you go north kind of far, like the Outer Hebrides, beautiful. And coral, loads of coral.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing that people don't realise, that coral doesn't only exist in the tropics. There are cold water corals as well. But yeah, when I work, I actually dive for my job now as well. So we get to dive Orkney. The mearl beds in Orkney are stunning.
I do want to finish my diving qualification. But with the world as it is right now, nobody is taking people on because diving isn't really happening. But it just this entire podcast has just made me gun to get into the water even more than I want to. Anyway, sorry, Jess, this podcast is about you, not necessarily about us. Can I ask you a very hopefully simple question that may take a very long answer, because I know you absolutely adore the ocean, you've already mentioned, but what made you fall in love with the ocean to begin with?
Oh, I think it was, I don't know, I want to say the ecosystem as a whole. But as much as I love coral, and I do, I wouldn't want to work in a laboratory or an aquarium. It's something about being in the sea and having a feeling of harmony almost, even though in the ocean, obviously, everything isn't harmonious all the time, but like everything works together and fulfills their roles. And if you stop and look, it's incredibly intricate and complex and beautiful, with each creature having a different personality, and I could just sit and watch them all day. I love them so much. But like, this is me talking about now, but actually I remember I loved the ocean from a really young age. I think I must have been like 10 years old, and I had fish wallpaper and dolphin bed sheets, and every weekend I'd use my £1 pocket money to get these stickers of all different marine creatures, and I'd practice drawing them, or rather on them and around them, because I was 10. And I did my Paddy bubble maker when I was around the same age as well. So I must have always loved it, but I grew up in the Midlands in the UK, like completely landlocked. I didn't have any connection to the ocean. It wasn't like we went all the time, so I don't know where it came from. I don't know the answer to this question. I don't know what made me fall in love with it.
That was such an amazing answer, though. That was a real beautiful answer. And now I'm going to make it even harder and say, but why corals?
Oh, I guess I've got quite a biased opinion. I think that they're just the most fascinating animal on the planet. Does that sound too dramatic?
Tell us why.
They're like the most simple creatures with no brain. They've got such a basic nervous system, and yet they possess the ability to do the most complex processes. Like, it uses this microscopic component present in seawater and is able to use this to build a skeleton. How does it do that without a brain? It's magic. Corals are magic.
I love your answers, Jess. I just want to speak to you all of the time. Right, okay. Let me keep myself on track. What got you into conservation? So, just as a quick background, Jess and I first met when we did our first degree together, geography, at the University of Birmingham. So, were you into conservation before we met, or was it the degree of geography that really opened your eyes?
I think this is probably quite a long story, and you're both in it. Should I start at the beginning?
Yes.
I can't make it into an exciting twist at the end. Like, surprise, I now own a pizza shop because I'm on the podcast. Oh, I guess I've always loved nature and ecology. And I bet everyone says that. Everyone on this podcast has said that. But it's the truth. And I think marine biology has flickered in and out of my life since I was young. Like how I had the marine bedroom and how I did the bubble maker, even though I had no interest in diving at the time or pursuing that. I just thought it was something fun to do. But then when it came to choosing a university subject, I did see oceanography advertised, and I thought, yeah, that's what I want to do. But I hadn't studied the right A-levels to get in, and I remember being quite upset. And the careers advisor didn't know anything about marine biology, and they didn't have it as an A-level, and there was no specialists in Nottingham, where I lived, who knew anything about it. And they don't tell you when you finish school that you need to think about what you want to study at university and what you want to do as a career. It's just pick what you like. So then I had to decide what I wanted to study. And it was a toss-up between my two favourite things at the time, which were geography and law, of all things. Imagine if I'd chosen law, my life would be totally different. But I did choose geography because of my cheesy love for the natural world. And that is where I met lovely Lexi. I think it was in my second year of uni, and I was pretty sure I wanted to go into climatology, and I wanted to work for the Met Office until great lecturers. Lexi, do you remember? Mark Ledger and Sandy Milner. Do you remember them? I loved them. And I don't think they were particularly popular, especially Sandy. All he talked about was salmon, but they sparked a passion in me for ecology. And I had a book full of sketches of like freshwater larvae and all the field guides for river invertebrates and things. But then I went and I did my thesis in Mexico, my research for it with Operation Molestia. And I thought it was the most exciting thing in the world to study a fish. And then this is where I met Hannah. And then literally as soon as I saw coral reefs, I was like, this is it. And I'm not one of those people who's like, this is destiny. And I barely knew anything about the coral, but I thought they were the most fantastic thing I'd ever seen. And I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to study coral. And that's it. That's how I got into it. It's how it started.
I was going to say, and just thinking back to when you did start just picking up on your dissertation project, I remember you doing your diving and you were literally in the water all day, every day, just sat watching. It was damselfish behaviour, if I remember rightly, on the reef.
Oh my gosh, yes. 6 years ago, you still remember. Yeah, literally I just floated all the time looking at things and writing down what they did.
I find that super peaceful, like you said, though. Just sitting and watching. I think my favourite things on coral reefs is sitting up real close and watching like what the worms are doing, what the fish are doing. Because like you said, there is, if you were to add the human aspect, that little bit of personality there, but just all of those different interactions and processes. So that's kind of how you got into conservation and your love and passion. What about the job that you do now? What is it you're doing now and how did you end up here?
I just want to mention that when I started diving, I didn't fall in love with it. Like I loved the ocean, but I wasn't like, oh, diving is the best thing in the world. I just felt like it was all right. I loved being in the sea, but I wasn't totally comfortable. So if anyone loves marine biology, but they don't love diving, then it will come to you, or it doesn't matter. You can do something else. But now I do dive quite a lot still. But normally I work for a wonderful eco resort in Cambodia, and it's totally dedicated to sustainability. And my role is to ensure that all of our operations are not having an adverse effect on the surrounding environment. And as a tropical island, the surrounding environment is the coral reef. So this includes everything from our wastewater disposal, energy efficiency, plastic usage, and I've also got a dedicated fund that's used for conservation and community projects. And I do workshops and presentations with our guests to educate them on things they can do to help the planet out, basically. But right now, the hotel is closed for COVID. Cry. But I'm still in Cambodia. I'm working as an underwater surveyor for a dive company, and we collect data on the marine environment, which is used to implement protection zones. So we survey seagrass, reefs, fish, invertebrate abundance, presence of seahorses, growth of critically endangered sponges. We collect all sorts of data, and this all goes towards implementing protection in our coastal area.
Oh, that sounds amazing. So I just want to pick up on something that you said there, Jess. You are absolutely right in the fact that you do not need to dive to be able to enjoy the ocean. Me, I still haven't finished my level 1 of my diving, which is upsetting, but it is on my bucket list for when the world opens back up. But I've managed to see so much just by snorkeling and kayaking. It is ridiculous. And Hannah and I spoke about even just the snorkeling around the United Kingdom and in Europe and things that you can see and can be a part of without having to go through this intense qualification that is quite expensive. So I think it's really, really nice to hear from somebody that works now diving all of the time that you don't have to enjoy it. You don't have to go straight into diving. It can be a route, but it's not the be all and end all. But yeah, Jess, it sounds like you've really landed on your feet in Cambodia, but I know it's been quite a journey to get there. So could you tell us, after the wonderful degree of geography at the University of Birmingham, what was your journey from then to where you are now? So I know that includes a second degree and some internships. Would you care to enlighten our listeners a little bit?
Yeah, so after I finished at university, I went back to the place where I learnt to dive, and I did all of the studying, and I did an internship there, and it was looking at the coral. So I learned ID techniques, survey techniques, more about coral biology. And then I did that for about 6 months. And after I went to the Maldives on another internship, and this wasn't like any other. So there's a marine centre which focused on turtle rehabilitation with a small coral restoration project. But you're essentially left to make your own decisions as you see fit. And I grew so much there in terms of admin skills necessary for NGO work and project management and coordinating volunteers, which are all such important skills not related to biology. But from here, I went and I did my master's degree in tropical marine biology. So I went from doing my undergrad in geography to not getting any kind of marine biology qualifications to just then getting experience and internships. And then I did my master's, and I did another internship during that master's where I went to Moat Marine Laboratory, which was in Florida Keys, and it's actually quite famous. It's been shared all over the world. I think most people know about Dr. David Vaughan. He shared on BBC quite a lot, and his novel technique of microfragmentation of the corals to make them grow faster. And after that, I got the job with the company I'm still with now, and that was in the Seychelles, working on a large-scale coral restoration project. And that's where I learned about sustainability, and I've just grown from there.
I think you've picked up on so many interesting different things that you did and how they've all linked together and flowing you in that kind of direction of corals and keeping up with corals, and the different skills you've picked up and how they are transferable, because that's something we like to talk quite a lot about on this podcast. And actually, just while it's in my head, what we were just chatting about is that if you don't like diving, but even if you don't want to go in the sea, you can still be a marine scientist. There's still stuff on land. I mean, if you're great at maths, modelling and things like that. So we've spoken a lot about coral, Jess, and all of these different bits of work that you've been involved with and are still doing. What actually is coral?
Okay, so if anyone isn't totally familiar with corals, they are an animal, or usually they're a colony of animals which all grow together as one big animal, and they vary from a couple of millimeters in size to a few centimeters. They are cousins of jellyfish, so they're very soft, and one single animal is called a polyp. And this grows and it forms a skeleton around itself. It's kind of like a cup shape, which it hides in. There are about 6,000 species of coral around the world, with some growing in warm, shallow waters, as famous coral reefs are known, but others thrive in deep waters and cold waters on the sea floor. I think there's around 700 of the stony corals, which are the reef-building type of tropical corals, and then there's more soft corals and whip corals and other types of corals.
Yeah, so you just said a massive number there, like 6,000, was it? Species of coral?
Yeah, something like that.
What's your favourite species?
Or Galaxia, which is a genus, and I think it probably got the name because it looks like something from another world, and it's these big star-shaped polyps with tentacles that like sway in the currents. They're so beautiful. There's also a bubble coral, which is pretty much what it sounds like, and it has these big bean-shaped blobs. I don't know how it works. I don't even know how it feeds with those big blobs. I don't know, but it's so cool. I think all listeners should Google bubble coral right now because it's awesome.
Actually, just picking up on that, if people were to go diving during the day, and correct me if I'm wrong here, because I don't work on coral and haven't been on a tropical coral reef for some years. If you go diving in the day, say stony coral, which is the reef-building coral, will just look like stoniness. Whereas if you go at night, that's when all the tentacles come out and they're feeding, and it's quite a show to see, right?
You know what? Yes, normally, but Cambodia is so weird. Like it gets quite hot. Like now it's 30 something degrees, and the siltation in the water is so much. It's normally only a couple of meters visibility, and it's really nutrient rich. So all the things that corals hate. And yet, coral health here is amazing, and everyone's always got the tentacles out all of the time. So, yeah, normally you're right, but Cambodia is just an enigma.
That sounds really exciting, though, that you can just see some really bizarre behaviour from these animals that you studied for years. So, you've mentioned that we can get coral in Scotland, but where else can we find coral globally? So, Cambodia, Scotland, where else are we looking for coral?
I don't know exactly, but I want to say most oceans in the world will probably have some kind of Cnidaria, like the main coral family. I'm sure they will. Like, because they grow in such a variety of habitats, because they can grow in warm waters. So normally they grow between 27 and 29-degree waters. That's what the tropical corals like. But they're also the one of the most healthy reefs in the world is in the Persian Arabian Gulf, and temperatures go from like 18 degrees to 40 something degrees, and we've still got tropical corals that are thriving there, and we've got them in cold climates in deep waters. So I'm sure there's going to be like a coral expert listening to this and thinking she's wrong, but I bet they're everywhere. And like, it's not just, so I said there's 6,000 species but of coral, but then they provide homes to millions more species. It's not just about the coral, it's about the other species that they support. There's thousands of species of fish and shrimps and crabs and worms and turtles and dolphins, and there's estimated to be millions more uncovered species living there. But coral reefs are already the most diverse and viable ecosystems on the planet, far more so than the rainforests. I vote that we start to call rainforests the coral reefs of the land, rather than how we say the coral reefs of the rainforest of the sea, because it's just not fair to the corals. But then that's another problem as we lose the coral reefs and as we start to lose some of those thousands of species, we also lose the millions more that are dependent upon the coral.
Maybe that's what we can do with this podcast. That'll be our legacy.
Start renaming things.
Rename the rainforest to the coral reef of the earth.
I think we should.
But it is true that our oceans are so full of life. And that's one of the things that gets my goat is when people are like, "Oh yeah, there's nothing in the ocean." You hear it quite a lot.
Blasphemy.
Oh, big expanses of nothingness, but there's even just microscopic things, like you said, that rely on these ecosystems and for them to be functioning and healthy. I was in a meeting the other day, and one of our icebreaker questions was, if you go anywhere in the world, where would it be and why? And I was like, I want to go to the most northerly tropical coral reef. So obviously that's one of the things we picked up on, is that with some of the colder corals, they're not necessarily tropical, they're just cold corals, and they're a different kind of reef, but they're still coral. And I didn't realise that that's actually in Japan on the Isle of Tsushima. Now that has significance for me because I'm also currently playing the game Ghost of Tsushima, and I got super excited about
it. Even more reason to
Yeah,
go to Tsushima when you manage to get to Japan.
And there's mantas in Japan. You could go and swim with loads of manta rays.
That would be, yeah, that's definitely, again, they're like one of the things on my dream list is to swim with mantas, because that would just be insane. Jess, you mentioned about the siltation. I actually didn't realise that the viz was probably that bad in Cambodia, because people tend to associate tropical places with really great viz. But that as well, that there's lots of stuff floating around and nutrients in the water for corals to eat. What and how do they actually eat? So what are they eating out of the water and how are they doing it?
So for most types of tropical coral, there's two main ways where they get their energy from. The first is by catching tiny floating animals called zooplankton, which are pulled into their mouth by their tentacles and digested. They normally get about a quarter of their energy from this, and you were right in saying that this is predominantly at night time. But the other 3/4 comes from a relationship that they have with a microscopic algae called zooxanthellae. The corals will acquire different types of this algae from the ocean's water column, and it will live inside the tissue of the coral. And as zooxanthellae is a plant, it photosynthesizes, and it produces glucose, which the coral can eat, and in return, it uses some of the coral's waste products, and it has a safe space to live. So it's a symbiotic relationship. It benefits both parties.
That sounds really interesting. So you've already mentioned that coral provides a home to many, many, many more species than just the coral that we have. But as a habitat, even though it is an animal, as a habitat, what does it provide?
Oh, so much. So much. Coral reefs provide millions of people with food, medicine, protection from storms, revenue from fishing and tourism. I think it's estimated around 6 million fishermen in 99 reef countries worldwide, which is over a quarter of the world's small-scale fishermen, harvest from coral reefs. And the commercial value of US fisheries from coral reefs is over 100 million. Local economies receive billions of dollars from visitors to reefs through diving tours, recreational fishing trips, hotels, restaurants, and other businesses based near reef ecosystems. And new medicine from the 21st century. There's so many drugs being developed from coral reef animals and plants that are possible cures for cancer and arthritis and viruses and other diseases. And also the reef as a structure, it buffers shorelines against energy from the waves and storms and floods. So it prevents loss of life and property damage and erosion. And when these reefs are damaged or destroyed, the absence of this natural barrier can increase the damage to coastal communities. So it provides, oh my gosh, so much, so much. It's worth more alive than it is dead, for sure. We need it.
I'm actually just thinking there, Jess, what you've just said about the storm damage. They protect our coastal areas from storms, but I guess there is a chance that the corals can get damaged when that happens. How did that repair itself? Is there human intervention sometimes, and does that mean you have to grow baby corals?
Well, there's certain species of coral there's different ways that they do grow, and one of the ways is having big branches. And a way that naturally reproduces is bits breaking off and then spreading somewhere else, and then hopefully it will settle somewhere where there's not too much wave action, and then it can begin to fuse onto a rock and grow. But yeah, that is the basis of a coral nursery. One of the ways that we would fill the nursery is by the corals breaking off, and then they're called corals of opportunity, fragments of opportunity, that we would pick up from the seafloor, which normally would have a bad chance at survival. We put them in the nursery and they grow, and we can either replant them back onto the reef, or they stay on the structure that's been placed on, and they thrive. They do.
Oh, that sounds lovely. So how do you actually go about, so you've gone out into the reef, you've found these little fragments of coral that have come off the main ecosystem, and what do you do with them? How does that nursery look? How does it work? Do you have a separate tank to grow coral in, or do you pop them back into the ocean somewhere safe? What does it look like for you as a restoration program?
There's so many different types. A coral nursery is literally just a man-made structure, and it can be in the ocean or it can be on the land, but the aim is increasing coral health, diversity, and abundance. So a nursery, there's so many different types, I don't know where to start. So you've got the frames which, if there's a lack of complexity in the reef, so the reef has died and it has all eroded down and there's nothing much left there. So where there's the intricate structures from before, it's now just flat. This is where I would put a metal structure fixed to the ground. I'd put the coral fragments on it and let them grow, and they wouldn't be removed. But the biggest project I've worked on is a mid-water nursery, which is like a hammock essentially, and the corals are suspended in the middle of the water column away from predators. The sand won't smother it, and the algae shouldn't overtake it, and this is the optimal conditions for it. So there's also the ex situ restoration, which is what I did at Moat Marine Laboratory in Florida, and they have these raceways, these big tanks, and they grow corals up to the size of these little plugs, only the circles that are a few centimeters, and then they place these all together on the bottom of the seafloor, and then they grow rapidly. So they can be both in land and in the water. There's so many different types.
I'm just having some images in my head of corals in a little hammock before they go off to live their new lives that you're creating for them. It sounds real chill.
Yeah.
you just mentioned that there's some predators that by having these kind of mid-water hammocks that the baby corals are kind of protected from. So what actually eats corals, or what predates on corals?
Quite a few different species of fish. They will eat the soft coral polyps. Some, like a few species of butterfly fish, have evolved these long snouts to pick out the polyp from the corallite, from the skeleton that it's trying to hide within. And others, like parrotfish, will just take a chunk of the whole coral colony, and then they can't digest the calcium carbonate skeleton, which it's made from, and they just have to poop it all out. So, white sandy beaches, which are famous in the tropics, they are literally just parrotfish poop. I think the most well-known predator is probably the crown of thorns, which is a starfish, and it can reproduce at a rapid rate. And without too many predators, it decimates an area of reef in such a short space of time. And this has actually led to culls in certain areas of the world. But we do need everything in balance, and each animal does have its own purpose. And we need a small amount of predation on the coral to keep diseases and things in check. But it's just when overfishing results in a decline of one thing's predators, it can have a knock-on effect throughout the whole ecosystem.
Yeah, I think you put that really well. So we've learned what coral is, what it eats, what gets eaten by it, and we've got a really good, I think, appreciation for the fact it's really important. It's a really great habitat. It is so valuable, not only to the ocean, but to us as humans living on the earth. So what are the threats to coral? Why do we need to protect it?
To the ocean as a whole, I'd be tempted to say overfishing. But for coral reefs, it's got to be climate change. There's some countries that I mentioned before, like the Persian Arabian Gulf, and they're super heat tolerant. So it does depend on the area, and some might not be as affected as others, but as a whole, we're losing huge amounts of coral due to global warming, for sure.
Yeah, so I've seen a couple of articles on coral bleaching, and this is something that I've witnessed in the Maldives. But what does that mean when we see that term? Would you be able to explain that a little bit more for our listeners?
Bleaching is something that happens mainly due to temperature, cold or warm. There's other factors, but it is primarily temperature induced, because corals are super picky creatures and they can only survive if they are in the conditions that are exactly how they like them. And one of these is water temperature. And I think I said earlier that it's normally between about 27 and 29 degrees. So when it gets too hot, some of the zooxanthellae that lives within the coral tissues starts to malfunction a bit, and it can produce harmful toxins. So the corals just spit them out. They don't want them anymore. And the polyp is actually translucent, and it's the algae that provides the coral with their vibrant colours. So without these, then the white skeleton is visible, and they appear bleached, which is why it's called that, because they just look white. It doesn't mean that they're dead, but it does mean that they've lost their main food source. So they must catch enough food to survive themselves, or they can acquire new algae from the water, because it's floating around. And some of this algae is there's different types that have different benefits, and some have they're more heat tolerant species, and they need to acquire some of those basically, or they will starve to death.
So it's not all bad when we hear coral bleaching. A coral reef can come back from that in time if the conditions, so the factors that you said, the temperatures are mitigated for, right?
Absolutely. Bleaching isn't a death sentence. They can definitely come back from it, yeah.
You've mentioned quite a lot there, Jess, and thank you for that. Do you think you could summarise coral restoration as a whole for us?
So basically, restoration's aim is to accelerate the degraded areas and establish a new ecosystem that's self-sustaining and resilient. So basically, you want to bring it back to health, but so that it can survive on its own without the need for human intervention after that. So the point of restoration is never to make a totally new reef, it's just to help the old reef recover and then survive on its own. So when a reef totally dies, the intricate structures that were once there, and they were once home to the millions of creatures, these erode away with the waves, and the reef becomes flat. And if this is the case, as long as the stressor, which has caused the death, so the high water temperatures or the high sedimentation, as long as these have gone away, we can restore the reef by providing more structure and more complexity, which is usually done by metal frames. So these are structures which are usually domes, and the coral will happily grow on these without being smothered or outcompeted by algae, and it provides a new space for the organisms to settle, and the fish have a more complex area for new hiding places and therefore new hunting grounds for predators. But if the structure is still there, so a low percentage of coral, but there's still the rocky bits present, then it's difficult for the coral to repopulate the area itself. So we would grow corals in a mid-water nursery. There are a few types of these, but they're basically just underwater hammocks where we place the fragments of opportunity and we leave them there to grow for around a year or so, and they have optimal conditions of light and water flow, so they often show increased growth rates. And then once they reach a certain size, like normally the size of a dinner plate or something like that, and they just start as a 10 centimetre fragment, once they've reached that size, then we transplant them back onto the reef, where the corals could then spawn, and then they'll continue to replenish the reef naturally. So you only really know if a restoration project has been successful maybe years later, a decade in some cases, when there are new recruits everywhere and there's been no mass die-offs which have wiped out the reef. So it shows that it's become a resilient ecosystem.
That's real interesting because, yeah, sometimes it is thought of that being the be-all and end-all. So real glad we touched on that. There's some of the other things as well that I'm just wondering about, the not just kind of fishing, but fish are also sometimes taken for the pet trade. Is that correct? And does that have much of an impact on coral reefs?
In short, yes, it does have an impact, but it is one of the smallest fisheries when compared to food, and it's super strictly regulated because everything is exported. If managed sustainably, the trade could support jobs in rural, low-income coastal communities, and so provide strong economic incentives for coral reef conservation in regions where other options for generating revenue are pretty limited. But damaging techniques like dynamite or cyanide fishing, which are occasionally used to collect the animals, as well as the possible over-harvesting of some species, and the high level of mortality associated with inadequate handling and transport of sensitive living organisms, they do pose a significant challenge to achieving this sustainability. But my friend actually works for the Horniman Museum in London, and they had Project Coral, it's developing techniques to stimulate coral reproduction in a lab. So let me just tell you before how there's two ways that coral reproduction happens, how we do get a baby coral, and we touched on one of them before, where the fragmentation happens, and then once they're fragmented, they will essentially clone themselves and create new polyps. It's called budding. But another way is by synchronized mass spawning events. So at the same time, many colonies release their eggs and gametes all together, and then they meet in the water column and they turn into little larvae, and then they find somewhere to settle. So what Project Coral does is it tries to recreate the natural conditions, but in the laboratory. And it's the first institution in the world that has successfully induced predictable broadcast spawning. So they replicated the environmental cues like the diurnal patterns and the lunar cycle, and they were able to get captive corals to reproduce. And they can actually speed up the diurnal, the day and night patterns, and the lunar cycle to trick corals that more times pass, and they can get them to spawn more than once in a year. So then we would be less reliant on harvesting coral from the wild. And this, I think, is one of the only projects that's doing that. But I do think that that's for coral, and if there were designated marine reserves with quotas and size limits, and population stocks of ornamental species could be conserved and managed to provide sustainable livelihoods for low-income coastal populations. So it's possible, but then the species that are unsuited to life in aquaria or exhibit low population densities or restricted ranges, or they've got life history traits like slow breeding that make them particularly vulnerable, then they would have to have special attention to reduce the risk of exploitation. Then it could be done sustainably. So there are ways, but there's definitely a lot of challenges.
Jess, you give the best answers, because that was such a balanced view of it all, because there are so many factors, like you just said, the human side, the animal side, the welfare side, the kind of, that is also, as you mentioned, can be a driving factor for restoration of a reef to enhance the chance of having these ornamental species, which can then be used to generate income. I'm just picking up on something else that you said there that actually we haven't quite touched on that I think might be super interesting. So you mentioned the larvae from the broadcast spawning, and that they swim about and they exist in the water. How do they know where to go? Do they have like a super sense of smell, or are they? Does a coral reef make noise? Are they listening for, you know, parrotfish munching and go, oh, there's a coral reef I'm going to settle on? How does that work?
Yes. Oh, I haven't studied this in so long, so I'm going to give a really bad answer. But there's so many different factors that a coral will look for, and it doesn't have eyes, but it has like senses. So they will go for certain types of settlement spaces. So yes, you're right that they will listen to the sound of the reef, and they'll go towards the main hub. So it's the parrotfish, they're chomping on things. There's also snapping shrimp. They're particularly important indicators of a healthy reef. And then they want to find a settlement substrate that isn't sandy, that's not going to smother them, that there's not turf algae that will compete with them and overgrow them. But I remember there being studies done, and I remember watching TED Talks years ago about how they will go to different colours and different materials. So look at sea core.
So they're very clever little babies with no brains that figure out where to live.
Honestly, they're magic. I told you.
I am convinced now. Coral's magic, full stop. So just to carry on a little bit and still stay on this theme of like the threats of coral. So we know the biggest one is probably climate change and the temperature changes in our oceans. And we've already mentioned some of the direct human impacts of the decimation of coral. But if we as individuals go and visit some of these tropical areas, or even stumble across some insane cold water coral in the north of Scotland, how can we ensure that we're not adding to this decimation of coral? Is there any sort of best guidelines of practice to follow? Because we want to experience these ecosystems, we want to see them, we know that's where the life is, but how do we ensure we don't damage it just by going there?
Oh, decimation. I like that word. I remember when one of the big newspapers, I can't remember which, they declared they were going to stop referring to climate change as that, and they would call it the climate emergency or something that truly reflected the severity of the situation. So like coral decimation, that's showing how it is. No, I would say from the UK, if you want to do something from there to help the reefs, I would say be more aware of your carbon footprint. Try and think about ways that you can make less of an impact. So eating less meat, composting, and eliminating as much food waste as possible, because this releases methane in landfill. Buying local, so reducing the air miles that things have to travel when they're shipped from abroad. Taking public transport, cycling, walking. Make sure that if you do eat seafood, it comes from a sustainable source. And this includes really doing your research, not just finding a fish that has a sustainable certification, because lots have these and they can be super corrupt, and they can just pay a company to get a certification that says it's a sustainable source.
I'm going to quickly interrupt you at this point
Yeah.
because it's very relevant. We also have another episode on this podcast where we talk to a friend of ours who worked for the Good Fish Guide in association with MCS. So that's one, if you are into your fish and you do want to know where to find the right fish to eat, listen to that podcast. It's a good start.
Yeah. Do that, because it's really important where your fish comes from. But I would say everyday things that you can do like try and find how there's a slight way that you could have a small impact on the planet by doing them. But a really great writer, I'm going to say his name wrong, George Monbiot, he does like political and environmental journalism. He once said that hypocrisy is the gap between your aspirations and actions, and environmentalists have high aspirations and they want to live ethically, and they will always fall short. But the alternative to hypocrisy isn't moral purity, it's cynicism. So give me hypocrisy any day. And I think he's so right. We need billions of people doing things imperfectly rather than a few people doing things perfectly. I wrote a blog post a few years ago, plugging myself, that was called The Conundrum of a Counterproductive Conservationist. And it was about how my actions of like flying can be super detrimental to the planet, and how I was going somewhere to save the coral reefs, but by going there, I was doing something which I know would harm them. But there's always more we can do, and we should be praising each other and celebrating one another for having a meat-free meal rather than criticizing each other for not doing enough. So small wins, because not everyone's perfect. But I think most people who are going to be listening to this are not going to be going in reefs all the time and being around the corals. So these are just things that you could do. But there's an organisation called Green Fins. I think it's predominantly in Southeast Asia. But if you're going to go with a dive resort or a marine tourism company, look for the Green Fin certification, because this is a company that has strict guidelines on how you can be environmentally conscious and how you can run a tourism company while protecting the ocean. So they have moderators that will come from Green Fins, and they go there regularly to see the operations. So they have practices like don't kick the coral and loads of other things. So if you are going, check out Green Fins just to make sure you're wised up, you're clued up on good practices, basically.
I think that's really interesting, and I absolutely adore what you just said there, Jess, about the whole 0 or 100, because again, this is, all of our opinions that we say are our own personal opinions on this podcast, and we always make that very clear. But I totally agree that if everyone does just a little bit, and we're all imperfect, rather than a handful of people being 100% perfect, overall, it will stem societal change and start to make real waves. And I am on all of the ocean related terminology today, apparently.
But it is that thing of making small changes within your time and financial constraints, really. It doesn't have to be that all or nothing. It's change a little bit that you can, that you know will make a little bit of a difference, because over time that adds up monumentally.
Absolutely.
And I think we've said this every single episode, but it's our message for this podcast.
I think I read something like if you eat one less hamburger a week for a month, it's the equivalent of taking your car off the road for a week, or something crazy, like a really small impact. It does add up.
Wow. Yeah, it's real great to be touching on that. So you've mentioned that at the moment, I think this question is going to be real relevant to your general job, but also what you're specifically doing while we're in the whole COVID life. As I think everyone's aware from all of our podcasts, we are recording during whatever day 5,000,000,022 of the UK lockdown, but the end is near. What does a coral survey actually entail when you're going out? As you mentioned, you're going diving. What are you looking for? You've mentioned lots of different fish, and how are you doing it? Do you just, swim along randomly, or do you swim along like a fixed area with a fixed survey in mind?
So we monitor several different areas. I think we've got about 18 monitoring sites, and we follow the Reef Check protocol, which is actually a super simple citizen science protocol. So there's people all around the world doing this. And monitoring involves just simple surveys, 50 meters long, and we measure how much coral there is, how much algae there is, how much other things there are on the bottom. So looking at, we call it the benthic substrate. And this gives us an idea of reef health, because we can look at the percentage of coral versus the percentage of algae on a reef. Then we go a little bit further and we can look at specifically coral. So is it bleaching? How big is it? Are there predation marks upon it? And we can also look at the ecosystem as a whole. So we look at fish diversity and abundance of invertebrates. And if you do this over many years, it gives an idea of resilience of the reef, so its ability to recover from damage. So sometimes if a disease comes in, it can wipe out the whole reef if there's only a few different genotypes, if the genetic diversity of the reef is pretty low. And this is a problem with restoration. People don't realize that. But if resilience is high, often it's to do with the genetic diversity being high as well. So some species are obviously a lot better, a lot more resilient than others. So if the disease comes in and the diversity is high, it may only kill a few different colonies rather than taking out the whole reef. So then you get an idea, okay, this many diseases have come in and this many storms have come in, but the reef is still strong, so the resilience is high.
That sounds really interesting, and I think we obviously talked around corals a lot, but it is a really important indicator of health in the entire environment, not just the health of the coral itself. So I think, yeah, the surveys and the monitoring that you're doing must be so interesting. But you mentioned before that in normal times, you work for this amazing resort, and you've done such a fabulous job so far of talking to us and communicating the importance of environmental protection and sustainability. But do you have to do that in your normal job?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm such a big fan of the quote, knowing comes caring, and with caring comes change. So, but I think it's easy for me here in Cambodia because, like, especially when teaching people about plastic, it's everywhere here and it hits people and they see that change needs to happen. So they're much more open to learning. And I give talks and I run workshops at the resort on sustainability with our guests. And these are mainly focused around how they can make changes to their lives at home. So I do DIY soap making, body scrubs, lip balms, natural cleaning products. So I use environmental education to inspire people, and it's so easy and it can have such huge impacts. I must have talked to hundreds and hundreds of people from all over the world, and they'll go back to their lives and they'll make these small changes and then they'll tell their friends, and the message spreads and action happens. And I think it's important with children as well because they're the next generation and they have the power to change everything. But I also train our staff as well. So we have like a plastic-free training, which teaches them about how the plastic affects their body and the environment. And a lot of the Cambodians here, they've never even realized that plastic was harmful because it's just such a normal, everyday part of life.
I think that's real interesting what you've just said there. That's like the juxtaposition of living in different places in the world. Because one thing, I feel like you're every UK small business owner's dream or competition in that you're creating all of these amazing little homemade sustainable lip balms and shower stuff that, I mean, it's just great. But also that, like you said, it real hits home for people when either they visit or you make them aware of the plastic around them because they can see it. And whereas potentially in places like the UK, maybe it's a bit more of an out of sight, out of mind, though it's becoming more obvious now, but people turn a little bit more of a blind eye because, say, you go to the beach and you don't notice all of the hundreds of wet wipes. I did a beach clean yesterday, so this is real fresh in my mind. And I've not done one in a while, and I was like, wow, I forgot how disgusting this is, having to remove wet wipes from a beach because people have used them and now they're just everywhere from the sewage. So that's real interesting, that juxtaposition of living in different places in the world and actually physically seeing impact and then obviously using that as an education tool.
Yeah, but the Cambodians who actually are the ones that live here, and it's everywhere, they don't see it because they've just become so accustomed to this is life. That's plastic.
But I think that's the thing. I think it shows how much messaging gets through the media that we consume. Because I think, especially here with the like TV, radio, Facebook, Instagram, I know my feeds are flooded with environmentally positive environmental awareness campaigns. And I think as soon as you start learning this kind of stuff, you can't unlearn it. So, I mean, I already know what you do is really important, Jess, but I imagine as soon as you get through to those few individuals and they're all of a sudden like, right, yes, of course, plastic, not great for the environment, you then can't go back to the way that we were when we were kids and think it's fine to then just use a plastic bottle every time you want a drink of water. So it may feel massive now, but it is that, like we've just constantly been saying, it is that small changes, bits of education, individual choices. You've spoken to us a little bit about the training programs and the engagement tools that you use and how you chat to the visitors coming through and stuff and the local people. But what does a day in your life look like when you're working with the resort?
Oh, every day is different. I work pretty long days because I'm really driven to like complete a lot of stuff, and because I'm so passionate about a lot of it, it's not work. So normally I get to the resort pretty early, and I do a little bit of laptop stuff. We have things like a plastic inventory, so we categorize every single piece of plastic that we have, whether it's single use or not single use. So every department will write down what they use. So we've got like the finance department who are just in an office, so they've just got like the printer and the laptop and the chairs and the pens and stuff. But then we've got like the housekeeping department who give all the amenities to the villas, to the guests. And I work on finding alternatives to them, among many other things. But this is what I'm trying to work on the most, because we do have a plan, or we did have a plan to be plastic free by 2022. They wanted to be completely plastic free, the company, which is, they've got 18 resorts now, 18 properties. So it's a big goal, and we're not going to make it. But I think the aim was, if you reach for the moon and you don't make it, then at least you'll fall among the stars, or something cheesy. So once I've done a little bit of laptop work, I normally have a sustainability tour with a guest, or a workshop, or a talk where I go in and I speak to them about the things that we do. So I take them on a tour around, and I show them the bottling plant of how we make our own tap water, and then I take them to the plant where we are filtering our wastewater, and we use this then for irrigation. And I take them to the solar panels, and I speak to them about that, and I take them to our mushroom hut where we grow our own mushrooms, and I talk to them about our community work. In the afternoon I might have another class with maybe one of the kids, something about like junior island ecology, and I take them on a walk around the island, and I chat to them about the wildlife. Or I might have a snorkel with a guest, or I might have a training session with some of the chefs on how they should be separating the food waste, and sending some for compost, and sending some to the farm for our pigs, which eat the food waste. What else do I do? Loads of stuff. Like I'm so busy all the time navigating between community projects and the things that we do with local NGOs, to training with the staff, to admin work on my laptop, to guest activities. It's so full on, but I love all of it.
I think that's real interesting what you've mentioned there. Just all of that. You are a busy Jess every day by the sounds of it. But you're working with so many people, because it's not just one thing to work with, say, your guests, because they're only there for a short period of time, but maybe you can send them away with a different outlook, or the local communities, because they're the people that have the vested interest in that their lives are there. So how do the different projects vary with the local communities? Like, do you still deliver similar sessions to local communities that you might do to guests, and vice versa, or are they completely different?
They're a lot more simple for the local people, because the level of education is a little bit less than in the Western world. And then I'll have them translated into Khmer, the local language. So I will present it to the English speakers, and if we have any foreign staff that are in it, but also I'll have it done in the local language as well. if I'm presenting to, like, I've got a reef protection training program, which is for the local dive shops and excursion companies. So I teach them all about what coral is and the importance of it and why it needs protecting, and finally what we can do. So we go through like all the bad practices like fish feeding, anchoring on the reef, using detergent on the boat, and we talk about how it damages the ecosystem and how to avoid it. And I'm hoping to create like a reef protection alliance. So I'm hoping that all of the companies that have taken part in the training, we can all come together and we can create this reef protection alliance where we all get together in a huge team and we conduct reef cleanups and we install mooring buoys for the boats, because our reef is still really healthy in Cambodia. We've got some sites that are like 100% coral cover, even though it's predominantly one or two species. But there's no need for restoration here, and protection is key just to ensure that it stays the way it is.
So, just thinking about your current job, Jess, and having to think about everything that you just said and the fact that you want to create a marine protection alliance is really, really cool. So, all of the data that you're collecting on your current coral surveys, does that data not only help for the monitoring of the system, but does it help figure out some sort of management of the marine space where you are, but then in wider areas as well?
Yes, so right now we do 2 surveys every day, and this could be seagrass monitoring, or we look at the sponges or the seahorses, or we do a cleanup dive, and then we come back and we enter the data, and we analyze it, and we can put it together in like reports. And then this goes to Fauna Flora International, who work with the Ministry of Fisheries and the Ministry of Environment, and they implement protection zones. So right now in our archipelago, which is the Kosadak archipelago, and there's a marine fisheries management area, and this has been able to be put in place because of the data that's been collected for years. They're trying to get it improved to a marine protected area, so that would be great. That's hopefully coming soon.
That's real great to hear how the data you have has informed things like that, and hopefully with this alliance that you're trying to form will continue informing change, and that's like the importance of data. I think we're actually coming towards the end of the podcast now, Jess, and I must say I've adored being able to catch up on everything you've been doing and having the opportunity for our listeners to hear how you got where you are and all the amazing things you've been up to. We've touched on how people can make a change potentially to their carbon footprint, or by selecting places that have like real good ethics and guides for how they interact with a reef, or guidance against using certain sun creams and things like that. Is there anything else you want to touch on, how people could get involved? Is there, remote data collection, some other citizen science projects, or anything else that we haven't covered that you want to chat about?
Yeah, I bet there is like, yeah, because wasn't Sav going to do some remote data entry for someone?
There was talks about it that we know somebody that was going to do some online volunteering, and that's the thing. Like, there's so many we think there's so many ways to get involved. You just have to have a think about your skill set and have a think about what kind of charity you want to work for, and see if there's an opportunity. And if there's not, do a Hannah and make an internship out of thin air.
Get in contact with charities or people like Jess and say, hi, is there something I can do for you?
Yes.
Because, people always need help, and it's kind of striking a balance between what you're happy to help with, what you're happy to commit in time-wise. Always look at your own time and balance it wisely. But yeah, I think that's a real great point, is that sometimes there isn't that opportunity right there on the page. You have to create your own, like I did.
Right, if someone emailed me and was like, do you need any help with data analysis or something? 100%, please, take it.
There we go.
That's how people can get involved with what you do, Jess. Help with the data analysis. Right, in that case, I am going to wrap up. Thank you so much for chatting to us today, Jess. Like Hannah said, we have absolutely been smiling through this episode because your answers have been so wonderful. Not only really well researched, and you've just opened my eyes a little bit more to the wonderful world of magic corals, but also you're so wholesome and you just explain things so wonderfully that I just want to press release now and put it out into the world, but it's on schedule.
Queen communicator.
Aww. Thanks, guys.
But thank you for like letting us pin you down and actually get this podcast done with you, because I think it's been on our bucket list for a little while.
Can we do it again next week? I'll ask you the questions.
Yes.
We'll figure something else out.
But yeah, that's it from us. So thank you for chatting to us, Jess. Thank you, listeners, for continuing to listen. And we hope you have a wild day.
Bye!
Thank you for listening today. As always, we have been Wild About Conservation and you have been awesome. Please do leave us a review. We would really appreciate it, and we do read them all.
To keep exploring with us, drop us an email or find us on our socials. All the links are in our description and the show notes. If you enjoy our show and want to support us, we are also on Patreon. Just £1 a month, 25p an episode, will cover our creation costs, and anything above that we donate to charity. Thank you to those of you that are already helping us to keep creating.
Our chosen charity for this season are the British Divers Marine Life Rescue, who are an organisation dedicated to the rescue and well-being of all marine animals in distress around the UK. Donations will go to training teams of volunteers and maintaining specialised equipment that is vital for their work.
Don't forget to look out for our next episode next Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts. If we aren't there, do let us know.
And remember, step outside and get wild about conservation. Bye!
How do you get wild?
Watching wildlife documentaries.
Wildflower painting.
Diving.
Wild swimming.
Ocean watching.
Rock climbing.
Bird watching.
Listening to podcasts.
Hill walks.
Visiting a wildlife charity.